Well, I'd like to welcome you all to the Oklahoma Baptist University booth at the Southern Baptist Convention 2021 in Nashville, Tennessee. We're having a great convention. We've had a number of panel discussions yesterday, and I am delighted to host this panel discussion talking about church revitalization and church planting, particularly in rural areas and in other areas, both in North America and around the globe. And I'm so excited to talk with our panel who knows a little bit about church planting, knows a little bit about church revitalization. Immediately to my left is a good friend, Nate Akin, who is Executive Director of Baptist 21 and Associate Director of the Pillar Church Planting Network. Immediately to his left is a good friend, Chad Vandiver, who we partnered with at OBU, missions pastor at First Colleyville, and been with the IMB, been all over the world. Can't wait to talk to you. Immediately to his left is Dr. Matthew Emerson, Professor of Theology at OBU, and one of our academic deans who has led faithfully the Hobbs College of Theology and Ministry and has served in North America as well. I'm Heath Thomas. I'm the president of OBU. And let's just begin our conversation talking about the importance of church planting and church revitalization. There are a lot of things in our convention right now that divide us, that create wedges, but if there's anything that we can unite on is we as Baptists love to plant churches, to advance the gospel together. So Nate, talk to us a little bit about when you think about Baptist 21, our SBC, what is the importance of church planting and revitalization from your perspective, and maybe Baptist 21 and Pillar?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say we try to say we're Bible people, the Southern Baptists, and I think the very clear picture of the New Testament, both in what you would say theologically about the church, and then the pattern you would see is how has God chosen to reconcile the world to himself, and he's chosen to do that through the local church. And so how do we primarily accomplish his mission? We do that by establishing healthy, reproducing churches that will reproduce themselves and keep reproducing themselves. And so I would say it like this. What is the primary goal of missions? I would say is that we would be able to form disciples who can stand before God on Judgment Day with a good confession. Right. But the penultimate goal would then be to plant churches that create those kind of disciples. And so it's just at the heart of the mission of God. And so if we're going to be about that kind of work, we're going to be about both strengthening churches that are struggling so that they can become those sort of churches that both reproduce disciples and themselves, and then also plant churches in areas that need a gospel witness. And so that's why I think we need to be kind of wholeheartedly for this. We also learned this, and you would probably know better than I, but as you plant churches, it actually makes your church stronger. And so it's maybe counterintuitive to the ways of the world, but most churches that are church planting churches are actually the ones that are thriving, and I think it's because, again, it's the plan that God has given to us.
Yeah, people on mission. I think that's right. Chad, why don't you talk to us a little about from a missions pastor perspective?
Absolutely, and you're exactly right, Nate. I mean, when you're a church-based network, that's one of the benefits of having a network that's planting churches, making disciples, because it does create a church that's thriving and that's growing. You know, I think disciple making and multiplying disciples really does bring the focus back on what's important, what matters. And the beauty of that, too, is it really opens people up to seeing how God is transforming the world. And, you know, my favorite way to transform a city is through making disciples and planting churches. And not only that, but I think, you know, one thing that we're exploring right now is not only church multiplication, but networks multiplying themselves. And there's something to that, I think, that where you have a church multiplication center that's planting multiple churches, you know, what if it became its own network even? And so that kind of multiplication is phenomenal.
Can I say something to that?
Yeah,
so one of the things I think we've lost, this is a broad statement. Obviously, you would find plenty of caveats to this. But historically, as Baptists, what we've done well is associate in order to do this kind of work. And sometimes lots of things can get lost in associating, but all we're simply trying to do is say, how can we collectively come together and plant churches and strengthen churches? And so I hope we'll get back to a more kind of fundamental what it means to associate as Baptist churches. And when we do that, rural churches and mega churches in urban centers, and all kinds of churches can be involved in the mission of God. And so it's one of the things I love about church-based networking. It really is simply associating and what we've historically done and just trying to recapture that and to perpetuate that.
And that's a powerful uniting factor for our convention. As I say, there are a lot of things that could wedge us or splinter us. If we can unite on advancing the gospel to the nations together through church planting and revitalizing, I think that will carry us forward. And Matt, you've seen this in your own life, in your own ministry, as well as both academic ministry and church ministry. Church planting, church revitalization, vital to who we are as Baptists.
Right. So maybe this is not common to everybody, but for my story, I didn't grow up Southern Baptist. I became a Southern Baptist because I wanted to cooperate together under a common confession for a common mission. And that's what it means to be a Southern Baptist. And so I'm proud to be a Southern Baptist. I'm grateful to the Southern Baptist Convention for what we do. I'm grateful for the education we receive, specifically with church planting and revitalization. What we're seeing right now is that for OBU especially, that's a way for us to help our students meet the needs of the churches today. So in Oklahoma, we need church plants and we need church revitalizations.
Yeah, and I think this is an important point because sometimes we might think that we're living, on our own home soil, right? I'm an Old Testament professor by training, so you'll have to forgive me for those who are watching online or those who are watching here in the booth. But as an Old Testament professor, one of the things that I know is that the people of Israel were living as strangers and exiles quite often. And Peter, the apostle, understood this as well. We, as followers of Jesus, even if we grew up in an area where our parents and our grandparents are, even if we grew up in an area where everybody knows our name, as followers of Jesus, this is not our home. We are living on foreign soil. And so we know this theologically, but why don't we talk about this a little bit from a church planting, church revitalization perspective? Is it fair for us to be thinking of America, North America, as, a lot of times it's post-Christian or characterized as post-Christian. I wonder if it might be helpful for us to think about it as pre-Christian in terms of church planting and church revitalization. You're in the DFW area, talk to us a little bit about this, Chad.
No, absolutely. I think that's great. I think there are a lot of people in DFW who assume that they're believers and then realize that they're not. I think there's a lot of people who haven't been discipled yet. And so I think when you start a disciple-making movement, like we've been able to do at our church, you start to see that. You start to see the lostness there. Another thing, too, in DFW that's happening is people from areas where there's great lostness in North America are moving to DFW. And so it creates a mission field there that wasn't there before. And so church planting is needed more than ever in Dallas-Fort Worth because of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And from the Pillar Network, I mean, I know this is a passion for you guys, is to advance the gospel, in a powerful way. It's true for Baptist 21. So talk to us a little bit about this idea that really in North America we need to take the posture of pre-Christian, not post-Christian.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? Because you have assumptions of being Christian of many people who we would say are unregenerate. And so you have to convince them they're lost in order to get them saved. And then you certainly have other places where it is increasingly, pre-Christian or secular, whatever label you want to have. And again, the way I believe that we're going to see them come to faith and flourish in the Lord is going to be through churches that make disciples. And so we have to do that. And I think we have to do that everywhere. So different organizations may focus on major cities, and I get that. You have to focus somewhere. But the good thing about other networks is we can say, look, no, wherever you are as a church and you want to multiply yourself, there needs to be healthy churches here that are making disciples. And so let's just do this everywhere. Everybody can be involved in this kind of mission, particularly, again, if we associate. And so let's just kind of get after it. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that we see this with the Sin Network, there are Sin Cities, and city has been a major strategy for Southern Baptists. But Oklahoma is primarily rural. A lot of our states are primarily rural. And there are people in rural cities, there are people in rural towns, And there are lost people, as we know, in rural towns. So let's talk about church planting and church revitalization in rural North America and maybe beyond. So Matt, talk to us a little bit about one of the things that we've worked hard at OBU with is to provide a sustainable platform for church planting and revitalization. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Right. So with the conversation around church planting and revitalization, whether it's rural or urban, we're talking about, and whether it's in North America or overseas, we're talking about situations where people have to increasingly be bivocational or co-vocational. And so at OBU, we have a degree called the BA in Global Marketplace Engagement, which equips students in Bible, theology, and ministry. And then they have a semester on the field, wherever that is for them, whether it's in Harlem or in Justin, Texas, or in East Africa, wherever it might be. And in that one semester, they learn how to evangelize in that culture. They learn language acquisition. But they also are equipped in a marketplace skill. So we get them the training they need to be biblically rooted, theologically faithful, practically relevant, but we also equip them in things like graphic design, English education, business, teaching English as a second language, all kinds of stuff they can do to be tent makers like Paul. And that's what we need with church planting and revitalization.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please do.
So I don't know the Oklahoma context as well as North Carolina, but there's going to be some similarities in the rural context. It's interesting talking. You are an international missionary. We always hope when we're international missionaries to go in and establish elders, pastors from that indigenous people group. I don't think it's any different in North America. So one of the problems when you get near a seminary or a Baptist college is guys will come in, they'll preach, and they'll pastor that church for 2 years, and then they're gone. Right. What they need to do is raise up elders, pastors, whatever you want to call them, who are indigenous to that town, who already are working in that town, and who can lead God's people and shepherd them in the right way. I think that's how we're going to do healthy rural planting and revitalization, is if we raise up, for lack of a better term, indigenous people who are indigenous to that context.
I think that's absolutely right. One of the things that we talked about with Dr. Hans Dilbeck as our executive director of Oklahoma Baptist, one of these, for a little bit longer, one of the things that we've worked very hard on is to create a pipeline from Oklahoma through, train them up in Oklahoma at OBU, and then place them back in Oklahoma. And a lot of that is relational, getting to know the pastors, ministers, leaders, indigenous, like you're saying, and then getting them to partner together, work together, plant together, serve together, so they feel like, okay, I can link arms with these folks. I can serve with these folks. I can advance the gospel with these folks. Absolutely vital. I think you're absolutely right.
And I think that's the goal of international missionaries, is creating this great cycle of reaching people in your home, reaching people throughout the nation, throughout the world, an Acts 1:8 strategy. But because when you do that, man, it creates this beautiful cycle that happens where you get movements. And so, when you have people moving from New York to the rural part of Dallas-Fort Worth, like Justin, Texas, right, you're ready to reach them.
Yeah,
So Chad, tell us a little bit more about, you've served in Montreal, Madrid, right? You've lived in Paris and East Africa, right? West Africa, right, Ivory Coast, right. So one of the things that you've seen is you've seen both city church planting, you've seen revitalization, you've seen rural church planting. Talk to us about some things that you find absolutely exciting globally in rural church planting that maybe the North American context could learn from.
Absolutely. Well, we're planting a church on the Galilee in Rosh Pina in Israel. And, when we were talking to the pastors in Israel, they said, we have so many churches in Jerusalem. We don't need more churches in Jerusalem. Every American church wants to have a church in Jerusalem. But so they said, hey, would you consider going to the Galilee? There's no churches along the Galilee. So there's a church in Caesarea Philippi that wants to multiply into Rosh Pina, which Rosh Pina means the cornerstone. And so we've started residency there. One of the things, man, I'm so excited about is, having been a North American Mission Board missionary, I was able to lead residencies using the Send Network training. Well, we are taking that international. So we're using Send Network training in Israel, in Burkina Faso, West Africa, in French. We're using it in Spanish in Madrid. So it's just exciting to see, the nations come together from that one training. So
that's incredible. And Nate, tell us a little bit more about Baptist 21. When we're talking about this group of leaders, pastors, uniting together. We're talking about church revitalization, church planting. What excites you from a perspective of Baptist 21 about church revitalization planting?
Yeah, so I mean, I would just say I've grown up in the Baptist world, but I am a convictional Baptist. I believe the New Testament, the best representation of the New Testament is a Baptist church, and I think that our theology is the right theology. And so what excites Baptist 21 is trying to create churches that have Baptist distinctives at their heart that are going to then reproduce themselves, because again, we think that is the most healthy expression of a New Testament church. And so what we're trying to do is have conversations about what it means to be Baptist. That's going to extend beyond Baptist distinctives, but it's not going to be less than what it means to actually be Baptist. And we're talking the importance of regenerate church membership and believers' baptism by immersion and so forth. This idea, I mean, think about, I love this idea that Matthew 16, Caesarea Philippi is planting a church in Galilee, where Jesus gives the confession there, and we hold to that, and we think that the church is God's chosen vehicle, and that's why I love being a Baptist, and that's what we want to talk about at Baptist 21.
That's great. Now, Matthew, we get to serve the next generation of future shapers. And it's unbelievable to see these students' passion. In fact, for those who don't know, Oklahoma has an unbelievable pipeline to the nations. Oklahoma has Falls Creek, where, hundreds and hundreds of students every year are called to ministry and mission, and then they're equipped at OBU and sent out. And now, anywhere you go around the globe, we see folks on the mission field who are Oklahomans who either were called to ministry at Falls Creek or trained at OBU. It's unbelievable. Matt, tell us a little bit about some of the things you're excited about from your perspective, looking at this next generation of future shapers and their passion for not only just church planting, but church revitalization, and literally leveraging all that they are for the totality of who Christ is.
Yeah, I would say that in general, our students are ready to serve Christ wherever He calls them, and that's exciting to see. That they're not intent on one way of ministry or another, or one position or another, but they're ready to go where God calls them, whether it's here or there. And just one example of that I'll share is on Friday last week, I went down to Falls Creek and talked to around 50 students about being called to ministry. So we lead a call to ministry breakout every week on Fridays. And I'm talking to these kids, and I ask them, what are you called to? I say, who's called to be a senior pastor? A few hands. Who's called to be a student pastor? A few more hands. Worship pastor? A few more hands. And then I asked, who feels called to the mission field? And over half the room raised their hands. And it was, I was shocked and just really encouraged by that at the same time. And it's the fruit of God's Spirit working in our midst, calling laborers to the harvest. So praise God for that.
Yeah, let me just say,
Absolutely.
man, my father was called to missions at Falls Creek.
Really?
So, yeah. So, that's how I grew up on the mission field. Yeah.
That's incredible. Well, if there's one thing that I hear from this discussion as we move to a close is quite simply this. What unites us as Baptists is rallying around the cause of Christ, advancing the gospel together, both here in North America and around the globe, in church planting and church revitalization. There are a lot of things that we can talk about, ladies and gentlemen. However, what we need to continue to talk about is leveraging everything that we are to advance Christ's name and Christ's glory to the nations. And we can do that. We can do that. And so I really do appreciate all of you for what you're doing, how you're serving. If there's one thing that you would leave us with as a word of encouragement, what would it be?
Well, just what you said, I feel it in my own ministry right now, is you get sidetracked by these, and I wouldn't say they're unimportant discussions. Some of them are very important, but then you wonder why the world thinks all we care about is CRT and complementarianism. Is because that's what we're talking about, and I find myself being guilty of it too, because you do want to bring clarity to things, but we need to say first and foremost, like if I'm interviewed this week by anybody in the media, I'm going to say what I want you to know first and foremost is we gather in order to send missionaries all over the world and to plant churches here. I'll talk about some of these other things you want to talk about, but if you're not going to put that in the article first, I don't know if I really want to be involved in giving you a quote, because this is what we're about.
Chad.
I would agree. I mean, we've got to be about the business of making disciples that make disciples and planting churches that plant churches. And we've got to be focused on that. And man, the more we're laser focused on that, the more we go back to the roots of who we are as Southern Baptists.
That's good. And Matt, it's absolutely true. We're about leveraging every student so they see all of life, all for Jesus.
Right. That's right.
So that's true of OBU. What excites you? What word of encouragement could you leave with us?
We have a generation of students who are ready to serve Christ wherever He calls them. And we exist to cooperate together around a common confession for a common mission. And we can do that if we keep the main thing the main thing.
That's good. Well, let's thank our panelists for this morning's discussion. Thank you for watching with us online, and we look forward to seeing you next year in Anaheim at the SBC. Thanks so much for being here.